Mobilizing the Home Fronts and Wartime Leadership. This is from chapter 15. Let's talk about the home fronts first. In both the North and the South, both sides struggled at the beginning of the war to outfit all the volunteers that they got and to arm all the volunteers that they got. In fact, both the North and the South had to turn away volunteers in the first year of the Civil War because they could not arm and outfit all of the men who were willing and able to fight. Another problem is that recruiting is actually done by the states. Both Jefferson Davis from the Confederacy and Abraham Lincoln in the North, in the Union, struggled with governors who were unwilling to give up control of their forces. These governors felt that since the states recruited the soldiers, they should be in charge of them. And that was a problem for both sides. When people on both sides of the war realized that this is not going to be a quick war like they originally thought, there are a lot fewer volunteers. Also, those men who first enlisted for short terms, and there are a lot fewer re-enlistments after those first terms of service are finished. So much so that by April of 1862, the South passes a conscription law. In other words, they start a draft where they force men into service for the army. And the North basically follows suit that summer with a draft. An important part of the Civil War was providing supplies for the military. And in the North, they contracted with private firms, with private businesses, to provide all the tools and materials that the soldiers and the army would need. Now, there was some corruption, there was some inefficiency, there was some major waste. But basically in the North, the economy is so strong that there is more than enough supplies and weapons and gear for the Union troops without having Northern civilians suffer any significant hardships. That's not the case in the South. In the South, remember, even before the war, there is very little industry. And in the South, they are also blockaded by the North, so there's very little way to get the manufactured goods into the South. As a result, the Southern government, the Confederate government, built its own factories, for example, an ammunition factory. But the biggest problem for the South is agriculture. For one, Southern planters are reluctant to switch from the cash crops like cotton that had made them so much money to staples like wheat and corn and vegetables that were sorely needed by soldiers and civilians in this time of war. Another problem with food and agriculture for the South is shown here. Look at all the railroads in the North. Look how many more miles of track they had in the North in 1861. In the South, the existing railroads were designed to get cotton and other cash crops to the ports so they could be easily traded. In the North, the railroads are designed mainly to get food from the farms to the cities. That's what the South needed, but that's not what the South had. When Union troops begin invading the South, they create gaps in the railroad system and make it even worse. As a result, there are food riots in southern cities during the war. As a result, Confederate troops are underfed and malnourished. And as a result, the Confederate government even seizes or takes food and compensates farmers below market price. This is a really unpopular program and one they had to stop as opinion was really turning against them. To fund all this, both sides, the North and the South, printed more money. And as we know, this does not work. This led to inflation in both the North and the South. What we see here is a greenback, and that's a vocabulary term for the money that the Union printed during the war. Now, because the economy is so much better in the North, because bond sales are better in the North, because there are more taxes to collect in the North, the inflation is not as bad. But in the South, the inflation got really bad. The Southern economy is so tied to cotton that can't be exported during the war because of the blockade. Some planters had to pay their taxes in cotton. This meant that the government had bales and bales of cotton stacking up that they couldn't export, that they couldn't do anything with, and that money that they were printing was becoming less and less valued by the day. By the end of the war, an entire wheelbarrow full of money could not buy anything of value in the South. Let's talk about the two leaders of both sides. Abraham Lincoln acts like a dictator during the war. And I don't mean that as he is a bad leader. I mean that he is in total control. Some of the things that he does that a president wouldn't normally be able to get away with. Lincoln increases the size of the army and gives money to military suppliers, military contractors, without congressional approval. Now, the reason he was able to do this is because he has major, almost total support from Congress. Remember, the opposition left. Almost all the Democrats are gone. So the Republican, Lincoln, has no problem getting these things approved. But he's not a total dictator. Lincoln still allows elections in 1862 and 1864. He still permits political discourse. In other words, allows people to criticize what the Union government is doing. One of his first actions in 1861 was to declare martial law. This allows the military, allows the army to arrest people for being suspected of aiding the enemy. He also suspends habeas corpus, which is a legal right that we have normally, which says that you have to be formally charged with a crime if you are arrested. Lincoln says that drastic situations require flexible interpretations of presidential power, which is why he does these two major things, puts the army in charge and suspends habeas corpus. These two actions allow Lincoln to suppress some Confederate sympathizers, especially in important border states like Maryland. But mainly, these are used to arrest and punish army deserters, to keep people in the army. Lincoln did close down a few very radical newspapers, but for the most part, he allows the press to remain free. And he's mainly very tolerant. In fact, he allows the peace Democrats to strongly criticize the war effort and call for a negotiated peace. On the other side, President Jefferson Davis from the Confederacy had problems. He promoted and demoted the wrong generals. That leads to problems on the battlefield. Jefferson Davis also chooses not to declare martial law, despite the fact that the Southern government is a confederacy. It's more divided. It feels that they're more independent. Jefferson Davis was the one who really should have declared martial law because he does not have the power to fix the South's economic problems on his own. And he is really strongly opposed by the state governors. While Lincoln had some problems with state governors, Jefferson Davis really runs into problems. Remember, one of the things they seceded for was their belief in states' rights, that each state is a sovereign nation. So Davis has a lot of trouble getting these Southern governors to give a collective effort to win the war. You can read pages 432 to 436 if you're interested in the early military campaign. It's not required reading. Here's a brief summary of what happens in the early military campaign. And that's it for this video.